Well, hello and a very warm welcome to my channel. My name's Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses. A warm welcome back if you're a returning viewer, and an equally warm welcome if this is the first time you've heard me musing slash waffling slash whatever it is I do. So as you know, I've been reading the Women's Prize for Nonfiction Longlist. It's the very first year of this award and I'm really keen to support it. When I embarked on this journey, I wasn't quite sure whether I'd make it to the end. I'm still not quite sure. As I record this, I've got just under a fortnight to read the remaining 5/6, because there's one unfinished, books that are left on the long list before the shortlist announcement. I'd quite like to finish it in plenty of time so that I've got time to make my own shortlist, but we shall see how we go. However, things have proceeded apace, so I'm actually going to talk about the 5 books that I've read this week since I last saw you all, and it's been absolutely amazing. So I selected the next 3 on the basis that they were the only paperback editions that I had, and I was going on holiday. I've just had a wonderful week in Egypt, so I took these 3 books with me, read the bulk of them while I was there, and again, just been blown away by that experience. And then since I've returned, I've got a couple of books here that I've also managed to read too, because I couldn't really put them down. Who knew that well, I'm sure loads of you knew that non-fiction could be so absorbing and so compelling. So I read, first of all, while I was on holiday, I read Wifedom by Anna Funder. Now I've read, years ago I read Stasiland, Anna Funder's book about the secret police in former East Berlin, and I found it fantastic. And this book did not disappoint at all. I devoured it like I would devour a novel. She looks at she looks at what it means to be a wife, but she does it through exploring the marriage of George Orwell and his wife Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and it's just fascinating because Anna Funder is a massive George Orwell fan. She absolutely loves his writing. She loves some of the things that he was he's very political, and she loves some of the political stances that he was taking. But in this book it becomes clear just how deeply flawed he is, and what's wonderful about it is that it's really balanced because of her admiration for Orwell. As she's discovering more and more about Orwell's wife and more about their marriage, you still feel that she's not too partial towards what she discovers about his treatment of Eileen. So Eileen was a very bright woman. She was a writer in her own right, although never really wrote. She edited a lot of Orwell's work and typed it up. She followed him when he went off to the Spanish Civil War, and for me the sections about that were breathtaking because he's fighting on the front, but she was doing an even more difficult job, working in an office where there was spying going on. She put herself in tremendous danger, and yet when he writes about the Spanish Civil War, Orwell barely mentions her, and it's clear there were several occasions when she effectively saved his life. I mean, the bravery of the woman was unbelievable. So that's, that whole exploration of their joint experience of the Civil War was fascinating. He doesn't even refer to her by name. He just refers to her as my wife, and in his writing. And not only that, he rarely mentions her at all. I think Anna Funder said there were 15 occasions in total where he referred to Eileen as my wife. So that, so the relationship, from my perspective, the marriage is pretty appalling, actually, the way that he treats her. And towards the end of the book it explores Eileen's, she became very ill. He also, Orwell, battled TB most of his adult life, so that's very interesting, looking at how he deals with that. And, you know, he forces them, well, not forces them, but he persuades her to live in some really, really very basic conditions where she's having to work really, really hard. He's busy writing or going off to Europe to do some journalism or whatever it might be. So it's looking at the balance of work and the balance of power within a marriage, and then thinking about that in relation to marriages in general. The other thing I loved about this wasn't just that the subject matter was so fascinating. It was also, because I'm a real admirer, I love George Orwell's essays, for example. Really, some of them I think are so brilliantly written. So, you know, I felt this was doing quite a lot of myth busting. The other thing that Funda explores is the idea that the vast majority of biographies of Orwell are written by men, and how men have ignored or slightly distorted or not perhaps interpreted moments in their marriage in the way that she might as a wife herself. So I think it's a very important book from that point of view. I think it's looking at very closely at sort of sexism, if you like, in the production of biography. So that chimed very well with me as well, in terms of being interesting and very important. And the other thing that is just brilliant about this is the way that it's written. So some passages, and she makes this very clear at the beginning, she uses lots of documents, she uses letters from friends of Eileen's, various bits and pieces of Eileen's writing, and of course Orwell's writing as well. But in between that, she fictionalizes moments. So where there are gaps in her knowledge, she uses fiction to speculate about what might have been going on within the marriage. And of course, the speculation is based on some supposition, but also little bits of evidence as well. So I thought this was utterly brilliant. So here we go again. I've got a problem. I'm reading all these books and they're just fantastic. This was my 6th of the books that I've read. So, you know, the bar is just so high. So I can fully appreciate why this was on the list. So I now have to judge it against the criteria. Is it an original narrative voice? I would absolutely say so, partly because of the way that the fiction sections are so plausibly interwoven with the non-fiction. Is it accessible completely? I couldn't put it down. Everything is beautifully and crisply explained. Robust research, absolutely. You know, I think she travelled with Orwell's adoptive son to Spain, for example, which I thought was really interesting. And one of the son of a close friend of Orwell and his wife's as well. So, you know, she'd gone to the nth degree to find out as much as she could. And is it excellent writing? Absolutely. I think it ticks all the boxes. I'm putting that on my pile of beautiful, beautiful Women's Prize non-fiction long list books. Sorry, I had my back to you then. So then I went to All That She Carried by Tiya Miles. Now, I hadn't come across this before either. It's won several awards. It's highly acclaimed. Tiya Miles has written lots and lots of non-fiction in the past, particularly looking at the experience of Black women. And again, the premise of this book is fascinating. So it starts with, it's all about a sack. Bear with me. I know that doesn't sound and hence the title, All That She Carried. So right at the beginning, you get this image, this photograph of an old sack that was handed down through generations of the same family. And on it says, I'm going to need to put my goggles on so that I can tell you. On it, it says, my great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. I told her it'd be filled with my love. Sorry, I couldn't make that out even with my super goggles on. I told her it'd be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. So 1921, Ruth Middleton embroidered this onto the sack, and this sack turned up at a sort of garage sale. So, and ended up in a museum in South Carolina, I think. And Tiya Miles becomes fascinated by this sack and what it might signify in terms of what enslaved people were able to possess and were able to pass down from one generation to the other. So what did ownership of property look like to Black enslaved people? And particularly here, obviously, we've got generations of women. So there is again, a focus on female slavery. And the story is so powerful. I love the way she gave you lots of historical background about the rise of slavery in South Carolina. There's some beautiful old maps that you can use to explore it. I didn't know that Barbados, in my ignorance, was such an important connection between Barbados and South Carolina specifically in terms of the slave trade. It's full of fascinating information, like the idea that at one point there were Black slaves in South Carolina, but also slaves who'd been captured from Indigenous Americans. And what they were doing was shipping these Indigenous Americans out of South Carolina and recruiting more slaves from Barbados into South Carolina to avoid uprisings, because of course the Indigenous slaves were being taken from their native land, and there were more of them. So it really does expose just how cynical and vile the slave trade was. And I enjoyed looking at it. Well, enjoyed is the wrong word, but I found it fascinating exploring slavery in a very specific area. The other thing that's interesting is the way that she unstitches, pardon the pun, the histories of Rose, the woman who had the sack in the first place. She tries to find Rose, she tries to find Ashley, she tries to find Ruth Middleton. So those sort of journeys of exploration. And basically she looks at lots and lots of different material items. So, there's a whole chapter, for example, on clothing and what, Black slaves wore and what that might say about their lived experience, that I found very interesting. I did have a few little caveats about this book. The main one being that I found it a little bit repetitive, and particularly the introduction. I really genuinely wish I hadn't read the introduction, because I think if I hadn't been reading it for the Women's Prize, I might have DNF'd it. I might have put it down, because I did find the introduction really sort of going around in circles almost. It read a little bit like an essay rather than the introduction to what the book became. I thought for me, it was a little bit misleading, and I thought that was a shame. One of the things that I think is really commendable about this is that the introduction is important because it explains that she is going to speculate a lot. There's a real sort of speculative, feeling her way process that Tiya makes as she creates this text, which I really appreciated. So I loved it, but I just felt that the introduction was a little bit unwieldy, is a way of putting it. So if you are going to read it, you might want to skip the introduction or skim read it, or come back to it, at the end when you've finished it. But it really did. I learned, I love a book where I come away knowing so much more than I knew when I started. So it would make a wonderful accompaniment to the Colson Whitehead book, The Underground Railroad, I think, reading something like this to sort of go alongside that fiction narrative. So yeah, all that she carried is going on the pile. And in terms of, was it excellence in writing? Largely it was, but I've just felt that the introduction and the actual text was slightly disjointed and a little repetitive. Was it robustly researched? Absolutely, it clearly was. Was it accessible? Definitely. Was it an original narrative voice? And I think it definitely was, because of I just love the speculative, feeling your way, navigating, you felt you were discovering things with her. but also incredibly informative as well. So this brilliant read. Next up, I read Intervals by Marian Brooker. Now, this book was very, very difficult to read. I found it quite a traumatic read, so it comes with a kind of health warning. But I think the subject that Marian Brooker is discussing is exceptionally important, especially at the moment, because it's being, certainly in the UK, it's being debated a lot. I think I'm right in saying that Keir Starmer has said that he will make a move towards legalising assisted dying. I could have got that wrong, but there's certainly been a lot of discussion. Keir Starmer is the shadow Prime Minister here in the UK. So it's very, very topical, this book. So Marian Brooker had a very, very close relationship with her mother. She really admired her mother. Her mother had multiple sclerosis, and she got to the age of, I think she's 49 or just before then, and her body is just giving up on her, not allowing her to experience life in the way that she would want to live it. Her mother's very artistic, very creative. She's a hippie, really. And so she makes a decision. They can't afford to go to Switzerland and to you know, have to go to a Dignitas clinic, because of course assisted dying is illegal here in the UK. They can't afford to do that. It costs, I think, at least £10,000. So there's a lot in here about poverty and about attitudes, the sort of double standard that we have towards end-of-life care and the end-of-life experience, which can be very different depending on your income. I'm sure that's true in lots of countries. So she looks at that, and her mother discovers that actually you can choose to stop eating and to stop drinking. So that's what she does. And even when you can choose to do that, but you can still have medical intervention. So you can still have a doctor come and administer pain relief and all of those sorts of things, but they won't feed you, and they won't give you anything to drink. So basically the book charts that whole experience. Marian Brooker spends time introducing us to her mother, to her relationship with her mother, to the cottage that they live in. And I found moments in this. I think I lost both my parents through cancer and experienced, you know, their final weeks in my father's case, months in my mother's case. And you know, that whole idea of, you know, there are moments that she describes in here, for example, where you are just listening to their every breath, you know, for hours on end. And that kind of thing I found really, I think it's wonderful that somebody is writing so candidly about this subject matter. The book's called Intervals, and I did find, again, I just found it, for me, it was slightly disjointed. So there were sections where she was, you know, looking at what was happening to her mother, and then she'd kind of leap to some sort of explanation of research or something like that. And occasionally it jarred on me. Now, I don't know whether that was just how I was feeling when I read it. And I am being really nitpicky because it's so hard to choose between these books. They are amazing. But I think this is an incredibly important book. So it's going on the pile. And does it have an original narrative voice? I think probably. I certainly think the idea of exploring this particular experience is novel, and that sounds trivializing, and I don't mean it to be. Is it accessible? I think the bulk of it is. I had moments where I had to go back and reread, and that, you know, that if I'm having to go back and reread reasonably often, it may just be me, and it may just be that I'm tired, but I think there were quite a few occasions where that happened. So it is accessible, but I think sometimes that sort of slight disjointedness that I was talking about made it hard for me to progress from one moment to the next. Was it robustly researched? Well, absolutely. I mean, she's partly writing about her personal experience, but she also clearly, you know, knows so much about the legal situation, about the practice of the medical profession, etc., etc. I thought she had researched it extremely well. Does it demonstrate excellence in writing? I think as a memoir, the way that she was able to write about certain moments so candidly, and you know, I as somebody who'd experienced similar things was completely engaging with her perspective on it, and it was reawakening a lot actually with me too. And I think that is what excellent writing does. So yeah, another incredible read. Now I've got 2 more books on my knee. These are hardbacks, they're quite hefty. And I must admit, these 2, I mean, Eve, that cover is utterly, utterly stunning. And I don't quite know how Cat Bohannon managed to do this. I am in awe of this woman. She seems to be an absolute polymath. She seems to know about sociology, anthropology, biology, all the ologies. She's, you know, she's really at the top of her intellectual and academic game, it strikes me. And, you know, to set out to sort of chart the evolution of the female body, I think is a sort of life's work. And she writes so deftly. She explains that there are lots of quite difficult scientific concepts in here, and yet I feel like I've understood them. I've been able to grasp them. So each chapter or section is about a different part of the female anatomy. So there's a section on ears, there's a section on, I don't know, throats, there's a section on wombs, etc., etc. And she takes with each section, she takes a mammal. Some of them are contemporary, but most of them are mammals that have evolved over time. So she looks at some, you know, Neanderthal females, but she also looks at some very small squirrel-like animals. And she's using those creatures to aid her understanding of how we evolved as female humans over time. And again, at the beginning, when she was listing these different creatures, I was thinking, oh my God, I don't know if I'm going to get my head around this, but you've got the most amazing illustrations that accompany it as well. So here we go. So this is, I haven't got my glasses on. This is Protolungatum donnai, who I think she calls Donna, if I remember rightly. And this is the womb section. So here's this creature look. Beautiful, beautiful illustrations and diagrams as well that sort of help you to understand the difficult subject matter. And this book sits really well, I think, alongside Matrescence by Lucy Jones, which was the book that I first started with, because, and there's a little bit of overlap. There are a couple of chapters sort of midway or towards the end of this that kind of really synchronise with some of the things that Lucy was writing about in that book, but they are very, very different beasts. The other thing I love about this is that although this is a very serious and academic book, I think Cat Bohannon's got a really cheeky sense of humour. And so there are quite a few moments where I'm reading this and I'm really smiling because of the way that she's describing things. So it's really entertaining reading. You know, for example, there's a whole section on Hillary Clinton's vocal cords, because she looks at the way that Hillary was struggling through her election campaign, and she compares her vocal cords to Bill Clinton's, and she's looking at, you know, the evolution of female vocal cords. And maybe one of the reasons, if I've understood it rightly, maybe one of the reasons women have higher pitched voices is because men's hearing starts to deteriorate as they get older. You know, is there a kind of symbiotic relationship? The sections on the evolution of the womb were absolutely jaw-dropping. I didn't know that there were creatures that had, you know, wombs that were split into 2 or 3 or more than one vagina. I mean, I'm speechless, which is doesn't happen that often. But I think you can see that I found this really, really compelling reading, and I'm so glad. Thank you, Women's Prize, for longlisting this wonderful book. So I'm going to put it on the pile because I feel like I'm rambling now. And does it demonstrate excellence in writing? Absolutely it does. Does it demonstrate robust research? I think Cat Bohannon is a walking encyclopedia. So, and it would be really interesting. I mean, I don't know whether she does, you know, she does acknowledge that there are other scientists who might not agree with some of her perspective on things. So if you have got a scientific background and you've read this, I'd really like to know, you know, what your opinion is. But it seems to me that she's, you know, she's looked at things from lots of different perspectives and done lots of research. I think this is incredible access. I think this is incredibly accessible as a read, and I do think it's really original because I almost feel like I've got to know her as well, which is a bit of a sort of, you know, grandiose thing to say, but it's because she's quirky and she's witty and I love her frankness. You know, she's really frank about things like, you know, the way that our sex organs developed. I love the way there are no holes barred, pardon the pun, in the way that she explains all of that. So hats off to her. And then I picked up the dictionary, people, just when I thought things couldn't get better. and again, this is so different to all the other books on this. Now it's not so much a pile, it's a tower of wonderfulness. So this is by Sarah Ogilvie, and she worked for the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, and she was moving, she'd worked in Oxford for years, and she was moving to, and she'd worked on the OED, and she was moving to Stanford to work there, and she spent a day going back to all her favourite haunts, and she ends up in the archives in the OED Central Place Library collection. I'm not sure what the right word is, but anyway, she ends up there and she discovers something that she'd never seen before, and it was the guy who was responsible for putting the first Oxford English Dictionary together was a guy called, I think it's James Murray, I want to say James, but his surname's certainly Murray. And she finds his it's basically like an address book almost of all the people who contributed to this, to the first Oxford English Dictionary. I just find this whole thing so awe-inspiring. So this man was tasked with compiling this dictionary, and the difference at the time between the Oxford English Dictionary and others, and probably to this day, is that the Oxford English Dictionary doesn't just explain what words mean, it also gives citations, so examples of sentences or phrases where the word has been used, and partly to evidence how that word has been used over time. So, you know, you might be looking at the earliest example of the use of a word. And that can't be the work of one man. So he builds this, or has built this shed in his garden, which his family of 11 children, because this is the Victorian era when he's doing this, a couple of them work on it, and they call it the scriptorium. So he lives in his house, and down the bottom of the garden there's this scriptorium, which I think was freezing cold in the winter. There are some staff that he employs to assist him in this major project, and I think initially he's given 4 or 5 years to do it, and the sum of £9,000. And out of that £9,000, he doesn't just have to take his own income, but that has to cover the expenditure of creating this dictionary. Anyway, so this is a list. She finds this address book, Sarah Ogilvie does, which is a list of all the people who've contributed to the creation of the dictionary. So he has researchers all over the world who are sent these slips of paper, and they are self-selecting. They're people on the whole who volunteered to do it, or who he's come across and thinks they might be interested, or connections of his have. And they're sent these slips, and they are given maybe a letter of the alphabet. They're given possibly certain books to read, but actually they can self-select as well. And when they come across a word that they feel they haven't encountered before, or it might be the first example of that word, they write it on this slip and they send it to him, and they give the quote as well. Who knew? I had no idea. Now, so the book, and I'm sorry, this is a bit convoluted, but it's just so interesting. So the premise of the book is that Sarah Ogilvie decides to investigate these people, and she kind of groups them. So we work our way through the alphabet. So A was for archaeologist, and what else have we got? We've got I for inventors, for example. I really enjoyed the inventors chapter. That was ace. So, so all these amazing characters who were involved in creating this dictionary. So I'll give you a for example. For example, one of Karl Marx's daughters was one of the people. And lots of course, a lot of these people are women. And very few of them are credited with their involvement in the actual complete dictionary because there were so many of them. So yeah, Karl Marx's daughter, who sounds like a right character and actually was a little bit difficult, she was one of the people who was involved in, she needed the money. You know, she was trying to earn an income from doing, or supplement her income from doing this. Her father was ill, etc., etc. So she features. You've also got these amazing men who were responsible for inventing, not just involved in this, but also for inventing the first electric bike. Who knew? And that was in the late 1880s, I want to say. So all these amazing characters. There's one guy who's involved in the project who was a cannibal, literally, not by choice, but he was involved in Franklin's bid to find the Northwest Passage, and the expedition went very, very wrong, and he ended up being fed. He didn't know it at the time, or so he said. I don't think he did. That he was actually eating the flesh of some of the other people on the expedition. If you want to know how that could happen, you'll have to read the book. Now, this book, I thought, after a couple of chapters, I thought this could get a little bit repetitive, this idea, but she just seems to, I don't know how she does it. I mean, I think it's been brilliantly put together, but she sort of, I don't know, you'll read about one, the inventors section, and she's making the point, that inventors are likely to be very interested in language. So the two things kind of go hand in hand. And then she'll swerve to some completely other sphere of life. And also the tone will change. The way that she introduces the next chapter will be very different. You'll be in a different place or a different time period, or it'll be some, maybe something that's happened to her. So the momentum of this book is really deft, because I couldn't put it down. I could not put it down. I just sat and read the thing. So, this is getting really hard now. I am still thoroughly enjoying reading The Longlist. I've got 6 more books to go, one of which I'm partway through. That's Shadows at Noon, because it's so long. I'm sort of, dipping into it every now and then. And then I've got the 5 that I can just see from over here on the pile across from me. I finished this earlier today, so I've now got to choose which book to read next. And I don't know. I'm looking there and I'm thinking, I'm not sure. I might just the Britannia's is at the top, so I might just take that one. It's got a lovely jolly bright cover as well. I love a map too. There's a map on the top. So anyway, I hope you found this useful. Please let me know. I'm really enjoying hearing your comments on the long-listed books for the non-fiction that you've read. I haven't got anywhere near the fiction prize yet. I'm really hoping that I'll have time to read some of them before the long list is announced, but we'll see how we go, because the 2 deadlines are quite close together. Anyway, happy Women's Prize reading, and I hope you found that useful. Take care, everybody. Bye.